Hello, this is Carl from Denmark, and this is a follow-up to a video I made shortly ago as a comment to a video made by a guy called Parlogram. Parlogram suggested that Beatles could have picked up the tune The Sheik of Araby from the piano player Mrs. Mills. I have to disagree for several reasons. At first, they could have picked it up from so many other places. It was a very well-known tune. It is rooted in the repertoire of the traditional jazz, and I mean the 50s Britain. One of the big things were the jazz revival. And there was a lot of traditional jazz bands around, and most of them had the Sheik of Araby on their repertoire. It is one of the most common standards in that style. Maybe not quite as much as When the Saints Goes Marching In or Bourbon Street Blues, but it's up there close to. And you can find recordings with Chris Barber and all the other great acts. So it was around. It was the kind of tune people knew, just like there are tunes around today that almost everybody knows. But most people can't recall exactly where they know it from and when they first heard it and such things, but they just know it. It's around. And it was like that with the Sheik of Araby. It's back from the 20s and was extremely popular during the 20s, but also later on and into the swing era. And there were still made recordings of it by Harry James and such guys. And also later on, and there have been made some a bit more modern, not free jazz or something, but a bit more modern acts. Oscar Peterson recorded it, and Bob Brookmeyer, and we are talking here about recordings from the 50s in a kind of jazz style that was not wildly modern, but not traditional either. And it was not isolated in the world of jazz. There were made more pop rock oriented recordings of it. Fats Domino recorded it, and what you could say is in a border field between traditional jazz and rock and roll. Louis Prima made a recording of it. And what is definitely rock and roll as pure as it gets, Johnny and the Hurricanes made a recording of it. And there may have been some others that I don't know about or can't recall at the moment. Maybe I even got them somewhere in my collection and just have forgotten about it right this moment. But there really is literally hundreds and hundreds of different recordings of that tune. So it is really well known. So of course the Beatles knew it too. But if you ask the question, what about a more intimate relationship to that tune? Because just because you know a tune, it's not exactly that it has any meaning or importance to you. So what can have been a more close bond? Well, the most obvious one is that Paul McCartney and his father before him, Jim McCartney, were both big fans of Fats Waller. And Fats Waller made a recording of the Sheik of Araby that is quite and Fats Waller made a recording of it that is quite famous. It's not like some obscure forgotten recording. If you are a Fats Waller fan, it is some of those. It is among those recordings you definitely know. So with this father and son thing about Fats Waller, you can be sure that the McCartney family at Falkland Road, they knew the Sheik of Araby. No doubt about that. Another thing there could have been, you have heard about John Lennon being a fan of The Goon Show and Peter Sellers and comedy records. Of course, mostly satire. If there was some sarcastic and ironic satire kicking against the establishment, that was just up John's alley. But I guess he liked parodies too. You know, from the anthology, there's "You Will Be Mine," which is actually a parody of a vocal group called the Ink Spots. Well, just hearing it on anthology, "My darling, when you brought that toast the other day," you may think it's funny, even though you might not know anything about the Ink Spots. But try to listen at some recordings by the Ink Spots. You will find out, as a parody, it's spot on, because it was the typical trademark of their recordings. They were singing a verse of two and then came in that deep voice saying something, "Oh, my darling." So it's so spot on. So if you know the Ink Spots, it's 10 times as funny. And why am I talking about that? Because the king of parodies in American music, so we are not talking about that British tradition of satire, okay, it's not that, but John might have listened to other kinds of comedy music, and the king of parodies in the 30s and 40s was Spike Jones with his group the City Slickers. And Spike Jones and his City Slickers made a very funny recording of the Sheik of Araby. So that's somewhere where John could have had some connection, relationship, bond, whatever you want to call it, to that tune. Well, it is neither Paul or John singing on it, it is actually George. So what about George? Well, I don't know for sure. In the first episode of Anthology, George is telling that the first guitar-oriented music he recalled to have heard was Big Bill Broonzy. I can't really imagine Big Bill Broonzy playing the Sheik of Araby. It's a bit out of his style. But as I said, he could have heard it so many other places. And one thing I think is a little bit interesting and thought-provoking is that, well, of course, it is not very exotic, that tune, if you look at the chords and the melody, but still there is a little hint, at being in Arabia or and such things. And well, when you think about George's later interest for Indian music, it's a bit interesting, I guess. So maybe, just maybe, even back in his very young days, George may have had some sort of fascination of things that were a bit exotic. I don't know, but he could have had. And I guess everybody has experienced that thing. Well, it could be you playing a song to a friend, or it could be a friend playing a song to you. But the thing happened that the one presenting that song is just thinking, well, this is worth a listen. It's quite good. But the one it is presented to goes bananas and saying, wow, that's so awesome. So wouldn't it been a quite simple explanation that George actually liked that song? And even though it might not, it might have been another member of the Beatles that introduced it to him, he was the one that liked it the most. I think that's a fairly possible explanation. But as you all know, the Sheik of Araby was not the only one. There were all other a bit obscure tunes on the Beatles repertoire in those early days. I mean, if there was a bit rock and roll hit from USA that every band in Britain was playing, that it's not such a surprising thing that Beatles did that too. But some of all those old show tunes and things like that, well, the short version is similar to that of the Sheik of Araby, that they were around. People knew those songs, and they did. And there's nothing strange about it. It's like, today, a lot of cover bands, I'm not talking about a cover band covering a specific band, like a Beatles cover band. There's a lot of those in Japan, but not like that. I mean that thing, you are having a party and you want someone to play there, and you rent someone to play. And they play songs people know and like to dance to. And you don't know anything else about those guys, but just knowing that you can make an educated guess of some of the things that's on their repertoire. And in many cases, it would be things that are several decades old. Some songs back from the 80s, like Purple Rain or something. And it's not more complicated than that. So that's the short version. But still, it may be interesting to try to find a specific source and saying, okay, that's where they picked it up. And at least for some of those songs, it is possible to make an educated guess. It's still just a guess, but an educated guess. Well, if you got those albums, Star Club at Hamburg and some album with the Decca sessions, like that one called The Complete Silver Beatles. Not a very good title, but that's another story. Well, if you got those, you know there's a lot of tunes we could go more in depth and into detail with. If I did that with all of them, it would be a very, very long video, so I won't do that. I would pick out some few examples that I think is of some importance and maybe a bit more important than the others. And why I think they are of some importance is in most cases because the Beatles used those tunes later on. So they were not just in that period. It was actually also after their breakthrough and as they got famous. So I think that may give those songs an importance that is more than some song they just played in the early days and, well, may have played just for fun and where there isn't that much to it. Some may disagree, and that's fine, but that's how I see it. So the first one I like to say a bit about is A Taste of Honey, which was on the Please Please Me album. And I know that a lot of people dislike it and think that it was the weakest track on that album and just a filler and not of any importance. I disagree. I actually think it is one of the most important tracks on that album, one of the center points or anchor points, whatever you want to call it, and I'll try to explain why in just a minute, but first let me say a little about that track and the history of that song. Originally, A Taste of Honey was a theatrical play, and there was this musician, Bobby Scott, who made music for it. And among that music is that tune we know as A Taste of Honey today. Originally it was instrumental, there were no lyrics. The lyrics came later on. But if you want to hear the original A Taste of Honey, well, you have to get this, or if you are, you can. Here's a picture of the original album. It's there on this CD. There are two albums put together, but you can see here a picture of the original album with music from that theatre play. It was an American thing. The play had premiere in New York in 1960. And yes, Bobby Scott is an American musician, but okay, now it gets a little bit complicated because the original play was actually British, but then it was set up at Broadway, and it was for that version, the Broadway version, that Bobby Scott, who is an American musician, made that music that were used on that version. But a bit later, there were made a British film on that play. Actually, the tune we know as A Taste of Honey was not in the film, as some kind of leading motive in the film. They used a completely other song. I guess it's a children's song, maybe a sea chanty, I'm not sure, called The Big Ship Sails on the Alley Alley O. the big ship sails on the alley, alley-o. Well, that sounds kind of cheerful in contrast to that melancholy tune. And the story actually is quite sad, tragic. But when you see the film, the way they have used that tune, it is kind of well used and it makes sense, even though it's a kind of very cheerful tune using as a lead motive for a kind of tragic story. The film is a part of what have been called the kitchen sink movement. It was a generation of younger directors making films in contrast to those old English films about the society and about Queen Victoria or something, and more about ordinary people and daily life. Thereas the phrase kitchen sink and often quite sad stories about people who doesn't quite make it. So it's actually a part of what was going on in British culture in those years, and thereby interesting. And you could say something of what was kind of setting the scene and preparing for the Beatles. Those boys coming from up north down to London and kind of breaking that that wall that sets that, well, almost every artist have to be Londoners, and London was the only place where something was going on. They kind of, set that scene of, oh, there's other places in Britain where something going on, such as Liverpool. Well, that's another story, and sorry for stepping out. But back in the States, the Broadway version of A Taste of Honey was gaining some popularity, and people took notice of that beautiful tune that was a kind of lead motive in Bobby Scott's music. So a guy called Rick Marlowe, as far as I recall, thought it was a good idea to put some lyrics to it. And it was recorded then by this guy, Lenny Welsh. That was the first vocal version. There had been a few instrumentals drawing on the popularity of the Broadway play, but this was the first vocal version, and I'm pretty sure that it was the one that served as some kind of blueprint for the Beatles when they made their version, even though there are some differences, but it's quite clearly to hear that they have been listening to this version. And, well, then after that there have been made hundreds of versions, both vocal and instrumental. There's a famous one by Herb Alpert, and, well, Tony Bennett has recorded it, and, well, countless others. So let's not get into that. But yes, I guess it was Lenny Welsh that you could call the original, or at least the first vocal version that serves as the blueprint for the Beatles version. perhaps a little extra, I can tell that it also had its place in the British trad movement because Ager Bilk made a recording of it in '62, so it was shortly before the Beatles made their version. But why do I think it's one of the center point recordings, center point songs of Please Please Me, when most other people think it's just a filler and not of any importance? Well, I'll try to explain it and make it as short as possible. I could talk a long time about this, but I try to make it short. I said before that the story in the play is kind of sad, and of course there are this melancholy in that tune. And as I have told, it was not originally a part of that play, but when it was set up at Broadway, Scott made that music for the play. And the lyrics that came later on was not about something in the play, doesn't really relate to that, but still there are this longing for something. I mean, I'll come back for the honey and you, and there is this longing for something, and you could take it as a metaphor for the dream of the good life or something. And that is actually how that other tune, The Big Ship Sails on the Alley Alley O, is kind of used in the film. And there is a point to it being sort of childish, and it's actually, the version used in the film is actually sung by a children's choir. And that is of some importance because the story is also about innocence and the loss of innocence. So, and you know, the ship's out there and longing for someone to come home there. You see the point. And this kind of longing, of dreaming, of hoping, and also that loss of innocence and the natural happiness of just, yeah, I'm here. Yes, I'm a little child and I'll go out to play and it's a good day and the sun is shining, and well, which is actually a part of what the Beatles represents, that joyfulness, and but A Taste of Honey kind of takes it a step deeper and showing this longing, and then on the album after comes There's a Place, this very introvert songs about the inside, and there's a place where I can go when I feel low, when I feel blue, and it's my mind. So this more extrovert, introvert, I meant, thing is kind of represented and is saving the album from being just, yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, that is what it mainly is, and that's what we love about it. Pure rock and roll, just going straight ahead, and it's wonderful, and it's, yeah, we like that. But just for a moment stopping up and just well, going into the mind and feeling what's in there and how do I feel, and it gives it a deeper tone that I think in some aspect relates to that harp sound of the early recordings that inspired by Delbert McClinton, and John Lennon in an interview always mentioned I Remember You by Frank Ifield. There was also another one called Sealed with a Kiss. But, well, let's stop it there. I just mean that harp sound, that very light sound, that was only on a few early recordings. Then later on, Lennon changed to another kind of playing harmonica. I think it was another instrument he was using, or at least he was playing in another style. When you hear some of those that came a little bit later, Little Child could be an example. That's a quite different sound. That early, very light sound. There is this kind of wind and harbors and ships and sailing about it. I think, at least. So it's a part of that thing. Oh, I talk too much about that. So let's forget about it. I'll make another video about that sometime and skip it here. Maybe it's not that important, but a few things I like to point out about that song. As I said, the Beatles was clearly using Lenny Welch as a inspiration or a blueprint for their version. But there are some differences. On Lenny Welch version, there's some women singing the background vocals in a very smooth and legato way. Ooh, 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 like that. Beatles made it more pointed, and you could say more staccato, by saying do 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 do, and all making it like a fanfare or something, you know. And besides that, it's the first example on the official Beatles recordings of a change in meter. The verse is in 3/4, and then when it goes to I Will Return and so on, it changes to a 4/4 meter. It's the only song on Please Please Me with such a shift. All the other songs, it's just good tight Ringo keeping the beat and making it steady all the way through. And later on, a lot of later Beatles songs had a change in tempo or meter. And when you comes to Sgt. Pepper, it's almost half of the songs where there are some kind of distinct change in tempo or meter. So that's something. And then, you know, a few months after the making of the Please Please Me album, Paul McCartney wrote one of his most beloved songs, All My Loving. And I mean, look at A Taste of Honey. I dream of your first kiss, and then I feel upon my lips again a taste of honey. tasting much sweeter than wine. I will return, I will return. I'll come back to the honey and you. And then close your eyes and I kiss you tomorrow. I miss you. Remember, I always be true. And then while I'm away, I write home every day and I send all my loving to you. I pretend that I'm kissing the lips I am missing and hopes that my dreams will come true. And then while I'm away, I write home every day and so on. There are some similarities in those lyrics. It is something about being away from each other and missing each other. That's the basic idea. And there is this central metaphor about this kiss. So that's two, I think, quite interesting things. I won't go deeper into it now because there's a song or two more I like to say a bit about. So rescuing this video for being far too long, I say no more Taste of Honey for this time. I can say some more another time. Well, speaking of which, I just discovered that this video is by now quite long. So I think I'll stop here and then make a second video where I go into some other songs. Because I don't think if this video runs much longer, no one will watch it to the end. So not much of a point there. So I'd rather make a kind of volume 2 or number 2 where I go into some other songs. But I think we came around the Sheik and A Taste of Our Honey, and I could say more and I could go into other aspects of it, but I think it's quite fine the way we did it here. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm very thankful if you found the time to see it and see it the whole way through. So thanks for that to all out there, and I hope you find it somehow useful. So thanks for now.